Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are delighted to welcome you to the conference Fossati Brothers, Swiss Architects from Morkete to Istanbul, which will be held here today in the premises of the Consulate General of the Russian Federation and tomorrow in the St. Pierre Church. We would like to thank especially our host of the day, Mr. Andrey Buravov, Consul General of the Russian Federation, for making it possible. Thank you, Mr. Buravov. On the occasion of this event, we are also privileged to have among us a delegation from the Canton of Ticino. Today, we will have a keynote speech and 3 panels, which will be moderated by Professor Dr. Yonca Erkan from Kadir Has University, who will lead through the conference. But first, we will start with welcome words. Please help me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Andrey Buravov, Consul General of the Russian Federation.
Dear Mr. Consul General of Switzerland, our dear colleagues from the Consulate General in Istanbul, dear Swiss guests from the Canton of Ticino and Morkete, dear participants and guests of the International Conference Swiss Architects Fossati Brothers, from Morkete to Istanbul. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all at the Consulate General of the Russian Federation in Istanbul. Its building here in Istanbul's ancient Beyoğlu district was designed and built by the Fossati brothers, talented Swiss craftsmen who left a notable mark in the history and architecture of a number of countries where they worked. The eldest of the brothers, Gaspare, is known to have left a rich creative legacy in the Russian Empire. According to his projects, churches, a military hospital, a railway station, educational and residential buildings were designed in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kronstadt, Tsarskoye Selo. For the development of the project of the building of the St. Petersburg Noble Assembly, where the Great Hall of the St. Petersburg State Philharmonic is now located, Gasparo Fossati was accepted as a member of the Russian Academy of Arts. One of his most famous creations in Istanbul is rightfully the building of the Russian Imperial Embassy, now the Consulate General. Its construction began in the mid-30s of the 19th century and was completed in 1845. The building of the Russian diplomatic mission, or as it was called, the Russian palace in Constantinople, deservedly attract, and I must say continues to attract to this day enthusiastic reviews of contemporaries, striking with its grandeur and grandiosity. Among the architectural works of Swiss architects in Istanbul, there are many other buildings and structures. To their merits, of course, should be attributed the large-scale restoration of the Hagia Sophia carried out in the late 40s of the 19th century. We hope that the representative international conference held today and tomorrow, with the productive cooperation of the Consulates General of Russia and Switzerland in Istanbul, will allow us to get even more and deeper acquainted with the creative heritage of these masters, to see with our own eyes one of their best creations, the Russian palace in Istanbul. I wish you success in holding this conference. It once again confirms that the creativity of talented people is the very cultural bridge that promotes rapprochement and better understanding between peoples and countries. Thank you for your attention, and let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Consul General. I would like to invite Mr. Julien Thöni, Consul General of Switzerland, to take the floor. Mr. Thöni.
Mr. Consul General of the Russian Federation here in Istanbul, Excellencies, Mr. President of the Government of Ticino, ladies and gentlemen, and also dear friends. I'm also very pleased to welcome you all to our conference entitled The Fossati Brothers, Swiss Architects from Morcote to Istanbul. And I'm very grateful that we can meet today in the beautiful premises of the Consulate General of Russia. Many thanks to you, Mr. Consul General of Russia, dear Andrey, and to your team for your hospitality and for this excellent cooperation. Organizing a conference on the magnificent, important, diverse, but also sometimes unknown architectural heritage of the Fossati brothers in Istanbul constitute a great common enterprise. This undertaking brings together the Embassy and the Consulate General of Switzerland, the Consulate General of the Russian Federation, the Dominican Study Institute, the Università della Svizzera italiana, the universities of the Bosphorus and of Kadirhas, the Russian Center of Science and Culture in Ankara, as well as all the academics, specialists, and researchers involved in this project. If I correctly remember, the project of a conference on the Fossati brothers emerged in a kind of organic way, if I can say, and developed as such. There was a strong desire by many people in Switzerland, and more precisely in Ticino, in Russia, and in Istanbul to organize a project about the question. And based on this common will, the project took shape. As far as I'm concerned, I have to tell you that I didn't know much about Fossati brothers when I came here in Istanbul on posting. And of course, as the COVID crisis started in 2020, we have been absorbed by other questions, and it is a pity that we cannot turn directly to interesting and important questions like cooperation in culture and arts. But that changed, and I'm very glad that despite this situation, we all found the resources to set up the project of the conference, and that we can also physically today participate in the conference. It was during a phone call with Tiziano Balmelli, the Deputy Chief of Mission of our embassy in Ankara, that I realized the interest and also the motivation of many parties, including the municipality of Morcote, the birthplace of the Fossati brothers, and the descendants of the architects, as well as the Dominican brothers, to engage in this very specific project. To organize this conference was also a rich intercultural experience, as so many colleagues with diverse backgrounds have been involved, coming from Italy, Russia, Turkey, and Switzerland. And from three, I must say, of our four national languages, we have colleagues who have been working on this project. But also from different professional backgrounds, as we have academicians, researchers, diplomats, and representatives of the church involved in this project. Even though the conference is held in English, we insisted also that this multicultural aspect of the conference is reflected somewhere, and you find it in the brochure of the conference, because it is written in 4 languages. Speaking about Switzerland, I'm very glad that High Representative of the Canton of Ticino, including the President of the Government, Mr. Manuele Bertoli, the mayor of Morcote, Mr. Giacomo Carati, as well as personalities of Morcote participate in the conference. Through Ticino, the links established between Switzerland, Russia, and Turkey with this specific cooperation mirrors the fantastic exchanges and experiences, influences, and talents which took place in the mid-19th century here in Istanbul. It is remarkable to underline the fact that the Fossati have been able to work for the Russian Tsar, the Sublime Porte in Istanbul, various countries which wanted to build their diplomatic representation in Istanbul. It demonstrates probably that the experience and qualities of the architects were the most important criteria which they were assessed on in order to be employed. It is also interesting to note that the Fossati brothers have been working on the mandate of the Sultan of the most important restoration works ever made in the Hagia Sophia, and before that on the new construction of the St. Peter Church, this time on the mandate probably of the Dominican brothers. Interesting also to note, when the Fossati carried out their works, the Ottoman Empire was embarking on a series of reforms which started in 1839 with the proclamation of the Tanzimat, aiming at modernizing the country. It is not a coincidence that exactly at this time the Fossati found their place in Istanbul, and it was a time exactly of rapprochement and development with Western Europe. At this time also, Istanbul was both very international and cosmopolitan, and probably the concept of East-West was not really applicable. Studying and exploring the past bring new possibilities for present and future cooperation. I wish that the conference becomes a founding block of other initiatives, if possible with the participation of Switzerland in the area of architecture, but also more largely in the area of culture, in order to further exchange ideas and to continue to build bridges in Europe with Turkey. I find it essential to present to the public the rich common European heritage and that we share, and which is still well alive. To finish, I would like here to thank all the participants in this conference, all participants in the project, for the fantastic work that has been done to arrive today at this conference. I would like also, again, to especially thank the Consul General of the Russian Federation for the great cooperation that we have developed and for hosting us today. My warm regards also go to the Swiss companies who have sponsored this event, namely Geberit and Sika. I wish all of us successful days and a successful conference, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Consul General. Mr. Haydar Ali Yıldız, Mayor of Beyoğlu, had fully intended to be here, but unfortunately, with a last-minute change due to his schedule, he couldn't attend the conference. Now, I would like to invite to the stage Mr. Claudio Monge, head of the Dominican Study Institute in Istanbul, who will host us tomorrow. Mr. Monge.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, welcome to this world city and to the ancienne ville de Pera. Welcome to this conference that brings us together from different countries. Once more, in behalf also of the Dominican brothers, Herkeseos Geldinis, benvenuti a tutti, Dobro Pajalovat. First, in cosmopolitan Byzantine Constantinople, and then in Ottoman capital, the Dominican brothers, better known as Black Friars in English, have constantly been present, albeit with ups and downs, for the last 800 centuries. This extraordinarily long and rich history cannot simply be confined to the spheres of a confessional service limited within the Latin Catholic community, but as always from the beginning saw the cross, the linguistic and cultural barriers of a complex identity dimension, inviting the interlocutors to be challenged by the richness of peacefully reconciled diversities. A place, as some colleagues will remind us during this conference, not only being observed, but also becoming a privileged point of view from which to look the rest of the world. Living at the heart of the international community of Pera was a great opportunity to forge promising and culturally fruitful partnership also for my Dominican brothers. Gaspare Fossati, who arrived, we know, in Istanbul in 1837, although initially employed by Tsar Nicholas I to rebuild the Russian embassy building, was quick to establish wider contacts, creating a workshop in the neighborhood that was inlaid by workers who often came from the northern Mediterranean. We know little about the circumstances of the meeting between Gaspare Fossati and the Dominicans, but it is easy to imagine that the community of St. Peter's, composed at the time, as today, by some Italian also brothers, found easy to agree with the Ticinese architect, whose monumental yet sober style corresponds well to the tradition of Dominican sacred architecture. We are particularly happy as Dominican heirs of that presence at the heart of the 19th century to welcome back on this occasion an important delegation from Ticino, mainly from Morcote, the birthplace of Fossati. And let me finish in my mother language. Spero di cuore che questa conferenza sia solo l'inizio di una collaborazione rinnovata anche per dare lustro alla creatività dei nostri antenati che hanno davvero interpretato alla grande questa internazionalità di rapporti di questa città-mondo come di Istanbul, dando la possibilità di un incrocio anche di competenze, di arti tra il nord e il sud del Mediterraneo. Credo che sia particolarmente importante in questo mondo dove le barriere si rinnovano, in questo mondo tra Green Pass e difficoltà di spostamento rinnovate, ecco, rinnovare questo impegno di collaborazione. Ancora grazie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Monge. I would like to invite to the stage Mr. Giacomo Caratti, Mayor of Morcote. Please, Mr.
Honorable Consul General of Russian Federation, Honorable Consul General of Switzerland, Honorable Head of Council of State Republic Canton Ticino, estimated professor and architects, dear ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to represent my village and the entire population of Morcote on this day. In Morcote, we have always been proud of our village and our ancestors. And now I can say we did with good reason. Morcote is a small village in the south of a small canton, in the south of a small country, but at the same time is a great place rich of history, in a beautiful region that is part of a special nation unique on its kind. Apart from the last century of history, the Canton Ticino has always been a poor region, so many people had to migrate to try to make their fortune. Morcote was one of the gates to the south. From our pier, it was possible to cross the lake to reach the north of Italy and its rich cities, Milan, Turin, and Venice. Our fishing village was a little bit a little bit richer than the other because it was crossed by a transit route. But the most interesting thing was, because of that, our citizens were more open-minded and more inclined to emigrate. Another characteristic of Morcote is its morphological complex situation, you can see. Built on the foot of the step mountain directly on the lake. For those two regions, in our village, there was a strong tradition of builders and architects who handed down the secret from father to son. In this century-old tradition, I included myself as an engineer and builder. During the past century, they even founded a school. After the apprenticeship, the boys left their home to do some experience at their fellow villagers all over the world. Those people often made a fortune abroad, and then they decided to get retired. They returned in their birthplace to build real palaces among the fishermen's houses and live the rest of their life resting on the lake. Fossati was one of our most important family, and now we are commemorating them here. I will not speak about what they did, but I promise you, I will go back home and remind my citizens how Fossati brothers are still appreciated here in one of the culturally richest cities of the world. Thanks to their determination and resourceful, they have been able to leave their mark on the history. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Caratti. I would like to invite to the stage Mr. Manuele Bertoli, head of the Council of the State of the Republic and Canton of Ticino.
Monsieur le consul général de Russie, monsieur le consul général de Suisse, je vais parler en français, monsieur Quattrini va traduire en anglais, j'ai préparé mon speech en français. Je suis très content d'être ici, mesdames et messieurs, au nom du canton du Tessin, en tant que président du gouvernement, mais aussi comme responsable de la culture de mon canton, parce que notre voyage est important pour cet aspect culturel.
His Excellencies, General Consul of Russian Federation of Switzerland, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a particular pleasure for me to participate today in this international conference dedicated to the work of the architects Gaspar and Giuseppe Fossati, native of Ticino. I do so by bringing to you all the greetings of the government of the Republican Canton Ticino, which I have the pleasure of representing today in my capacity as President, but also as Minister of Culture.
Le canton du Tessin est un canton particulier en Suisse, un des 26 cantons de la Suisse, mais c'est un canton de langue et de culture italienne, l'unique canton qui parle entièrement l'italien, et c'est un canton, l'unique canton qui est au sud des Alpes. Cette particularité nous rend de sorte que nous, on est un pont entre le sud et le nord, entre la culture latine, italienne, du sud européen et la culture germanophone. Et ce rôle de pont culturel, que pour nous est aussi lié au transit qui ont été notre passé et notre présent, surtout avec les infrastructures ferroviaires, les infrastructures de route, est très important et d'une certaine façon nous lie, toute proportion gardée, à la ville de Istanbul, qui est aussi un point de rencontre de population, plutôt entre Est et Ouest, Ouest et Est, entre Asie et Europe, mais qui, avec nous, on peut combiner ce rôle de pont.
The canton that I represent is one of the 26 that make up the Swiss Confederation and occupies a special place because it is the only one that is entirely Italian-speaking, the third most important national language, and it is the only one located to the south of the Alpine chain. This particular geographical position and the fact that it is located on the St. Gotthard railway and freeway axis make the canton of Ticino a link between Northern and Southern Europe, a cultural bridge between Switzerland and Italy. The strategic position also makes Ticino the gateway to Switzerland from the significant migratory flows from Mediterranean. With due proportion, this role as a bridge between large regions and migratory transits likens my canton to the city of Istanbul, which historically has always played the role of crossroads and the path of people.
Le fait d'être une place de transit nous rend rend la question de l'immigration et de l'immigration très présente dans notre canton. Les habitants du Tessin, aujourd'hui, presque la moitié, ils ont un passé migratoire. Et un troisième des habitants du canton a un autre passeport ou aussi un autre passeport que celui de la Suisse. Mais si aujourd'hui le canton du Tessin est plutôt un canton d'immigration, de personnes qui viennent chez nous parce qu'on y vit bien, c'est une belle place, c'est très agréable, la vie a une bonne qualité. Dans le passé, ce n'était pas comme ça. Dans le passé, les Tessinois plutôt partaient, il n'y avait pas de travail, il n'y avait pas de travail suffisant. Et ils partaient avec des professions très caractéristiques, par exemple les ramoneurs. C'était très typique des Tessinois qui allaient dans les villes, surtout de Lombardie, à Milan par exemple, pour faire ce travail, ou pour vendre les châtaignes ou les marrons à Paris. Et même avec on avait aussi une certaine émigration vers l'Amérique et l'Australie.
Thanks to its enviable geographic position, the beauty of its alpine and lake landscapes, and the quality of life, today Ticino is a land of immigration. In fact, more than half of its population has a recent immigrant past, and more than a third of the population holds a passport other than a Swiss one. Historically, however, Ticino has been a land of immigration, whether to nearby Lombardy, think of the tradition of chimney sweeps, or to distant Paris, the destination of our chestnuts cellar.
Avec les professions de ramoneurs, avec ceux qui allaient émigrer pour le travail, on trouvait aussi des personnes très importantes qui étaient plutôt actifs dans le secteur de la construction. Et dans ce secteur, on trouve les personnages comme Gaspare et Giuseppe Fossati qu'on est ici en train de discuter aujourd'hui pour leur contribution culturelle aussi à la ville d'Istanbul. Mais il faut se rappeler aussi de Francesco Borromini qui a travaillé à Rome de manière très importante. Il faut se rappeler de Domenico Trezzini qui a travaillé surtout en Russie et de Domenico Fontana qui a travaillé à Rome et à Naples. Et pour venir au jour d'aujourd'hui, on peut penser aussi à l'architecte Mario Botta qui est aussi un des fondateurs de l'Académie d'architecture de l'Università della Svizzera italiana a Mendrisio.
In addition to the simple professional categories, many artisans, engineers, and architects have distinguished themselves by contributing to the beauty of many cities throughout the world, contributing to their splendor and raising their quality of life. In particular, I would like to recall, among others, the work of Francesco Borromini in Rome, Domenico Trezzini in St. Petersburg, and Domenico Fontana in Rome and Naples, but also in contemporary times, the architect Mario Botta. Among these illustrious names, there is clearly that of brothers Gaspare and Giuseppe Fossati of Morcote.
Gaspare et Giuseppe Fossati sont des personnages très importants pour nous, pour ce qu'ils ont fait. Il a déjà été rappelé par ceux qui sont intervenus avant moi. mais il faut se rappeler certainement cet immeuble qui est très important et on a l'honneur de pouvoir visiter aujourd'hui. Ce n'est pas toujours le cas comme touriste. On a naturellement les travaux de rénovation qui ont été faits dans la première moitié de 1800 à Hagia Sophia, et puis on a l'église de Saint-Pierre, on a la faculté des sciences politiques de l'université. Mais leur présence est très importante parce que c'est une tradition de notre canton d'avoir ces personnages qui vont dans le monde construire ou rénover et construire aussi cette tradition tessinoise des constructeurs, des architectes.
The work of the Fossati brothers consists of numerous buildings, both religious and secular, including the restoration of the Hagia Sophia, the construction of the Church of St. Peter and the residence of the Pasha, the Russian embassy, the splendid Russian embassy, and the Faculty of Political Science of the University of Istanbul.
Bien, je vais conclure. Je suis content qu'on a pu aujourd'hui participer à ce colloque sur la question culturelle, mais je pense et je souhaite que ce sera aussi la possibilité de commencer une collaboration d'autre nature aussi avec la ville d'Istanbul et la région d'Istanbul, parce que les liaisons culturelles sont des bonnes bases pour commencer des liaisons qui sont plus profondes. Et notre présence ici témoigne ce que nous, on veut souligner, c'est la volonté de relier des mondes et des places qui sont tellement loin, mais tellement proches, parce qu'on a des racines communes.
Mentioning these very important works, it is easy to understand the importance of the work of the Fossati architects and the strong cultural bond that, thanks to them, entertains the city of Istanbul and the Canton of Ticino, which I hope will be able to further deepen their collaboration even beyond this valuable initiative aimed at celebrating the Fossati architects.
Je veux terminer en remerciant le consulat général de Russie, le consulat général de Suisse, l'ambassade d'Ankara, l'Institut dominicain d'études, l'Università della Svizzera italiana, l'Université du Bosphore, l'Université de Khadir Has, et vous remercier tout le monde ici pour la participation. C'est important qu'on continue à approfondir et connaître nos racines communes, parce que le monde est si petit et il faut le faire pour nous, pour le passé et pour le futur. Merci.
I would like
Thank you very much for these nice words. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to invite Professor Dr. Yonca Erkan. Professor Erkan.
Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning in this wonderful building. Next week we are celebrating Gaspare Fossati's 212th birthday, and within this building I just cherish his good work and thank our hosts for this privileged occasion to be in this building. As academicians, we have not had any in-person meeting since 2 years, but we have this grand opening in this place, so I thank for this opportunity. I work at Kadir Has University as a UNESCO chair on management of World Heritage, and as a concept, World Heritage is the cultural heritage of the entire humanity. And I cannot think of a better cause than coming together for Fossati brothers' work, Russia, Turkey, Italy, and other places, which could make up a wonderful World Heritage nomination similar to Le Corbusier's work. So this is my dream, and I just wanted to start this conference with this dream. I hope this collaboration would turn out to be a World Heritage nomination that would last long. This morning we have wonderful and very distinguished guests with us. Our keynote speaker is Christoph Frank. Professor Frank is a full professor of history of the classical tradition at the Accademia di Architettura, Università della Svizzera, Italiana. His main interests include early modern art and architecture with a particular focus on the Mediterranean. He will be speaking on the international diplomacy, strategy, science and architecture in the Ottoman Empire from the 17th to the 19th centuries, and the title of his presentation is The More or Less of Civilization. Professor Frank, please.
Thank you very much for these very kind words. First of all, yes, thank you. Oops, that's good. First of all, I feel humbled, I feel honored. Now, first of all, honorable consul generals of both countries who host us, who give us really the frame for this initiative, which in itself already carries, of course, you might say, the international transfer that's always been inherent in your work, very important work as diplomats in these times. Honorable mayors who have also welcomed this initiative, and not least and not last, and not last and not least, our president of the State Council of the Canton of Ticino, who's always cast his inner eye very benevolently on the academia and our work in particular, that is in relation to the Archivio del Moderno, but also to our institute and the resources we have. And I'd like to thank my colleagues and of course all of you for this splendid occasion. Here I am finally in the capital of all the world's desires, and yes indeed, it's a large call, the more or less of civilization, a quote from Saint-Lambéry at the end of the 18th century, inaugurating the conflicts that would emerge with Napoleon and the Napoleonic fallout. This is a very large call. International diplomacy, strategy, science and architecture in the Ottoman Empire from the 17th century to the 19th centuries. And this doesn't move. Sorry, probably. This is called loyal opposition. It happens regularly in science. Here we are. First of all, I'd like to express also, I think, my very, very humble expressions towards my Turkish and sometimes Iraqi, sometimes my Syrian colleagues. Over the summer, I did a lot of reading and scrambled for the past. This extraordinary exhibition at SALT here in Galata in 2010, which I unfortunately was not able to attend, is an extraordinary account of many of the issues which are involved also in relation to another book which many of you are familiar with, Edward Said, Orientalism, as published in 1978, and which many of my generation have read very, very profoundly, and we've come to different conclusions about this book, which has seen a reinvigorated interest in post-colonial studies. For many of us who come from a diplomatic kind of background, it contains some very, very strange, sometimes, linear teleological explanations about the prejudices that were carried forward between East and West and East. Philip Mansell's book, Constantinople, yes indeed, capital of the world's desires, or indeed Larry Wolff on inventing Eastern Europe, were for me always fundamental contributions, the ones I could read. From 1670 until 1830, let's return to the origins. We're here in what used to be called Pera, now Beyoğlu. Indeed, we're here in the diplomatic quarter, and you may not properly see this, but many of you will be very, very familiar with these images by Jean-Baptiste von Moor between 1720 and 1737. And I was struck by this extraordinary image of the Dutch embassy with this terrace overlooking Constantinople, yes indeed, as if it were placed at the feet of the Dutch legation, which once again went back to their mercantile interests, and of course the Levantine Company, as well as all of the enormous mercantile companies that made, in the end, really the richness of Europe. We will be returning, particularly my colleague Girardelli will be returning to this issue about the extraordinary presence of those buildings over Constantinople already in the 17th and 18th centuries. And here another famous picture by Van Moor from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which has got this extraordinary collection that shows the extraordinary exposition of the building already having some 4 or 5 floors when, as we know, the buildings here in the quarter used to have 1 or perhaps 2. It is that pretense in many ways which struck me a couple of years ago when I went to The Hague, to the Royal Library, and found this Beschrijving van Reizen door Duitsland, Turkije, Italië en Frankrijk, 1764-1769, by someone called Johan Rey, another ambassador who was at the same time an extraordinary botanist. He was someone like Tourneforth. We have time and time again this very, very important crossing between science and diplomacy throughout the 18th century. Yes, indeed, some of these ambassadors offer such an extraordinary intellectual, scientific, cultural interest. In some ways, they're even Kantian or neo-Kantian. We scientists, we are primarily driven by wanting to know, by needing to know, by needing to understand. Indeed, here you have an image by Robert de Cotte for the Ambassade de France at Constantinople of 1722. He was one of the chief architects of Louis XIV and will be returning to the French. Yes, indeed, from 1670 onwards, the French sent archaeographic, that's manuscript collection, and archaeological collectors to the Far East and the East. These Missions archéologiques françaises were published in 2 volumes in about 1900 by Henri Aumont, and they cover some 1,000 pages of lists of endeavors on orders expressed as early as Louis XIV. And indeed, in 1674, he sent Jacques Carré to Athens in order to provide us with the first and very important drawings after the Parthenon and the Parthenon reliefs, which indeed document the building prior to its destruction by the Venetians and the Prussian general who actually shot the bomb into the Temple of Temples. Yes, indeed, this loss has never been recovered. And there's so much still in the archives, and we see here these remarkable drawings. There are also unprejudiced positions. Lord Charlemont, James Caulfield, who is Irish by birth, but who is one of these Anglo-British noblemen, was entirely unprejudiced for once. He published this very famous account. He didn't publish it, he wrote it up in 2 volumes of his journey, yes indeed, to Greece and Turkey in 1749-1750. He was Voltairean, he was probably an agnostic in many ways, but what is interesting is that he says, let's confront it. The Turks are not illiterate, as it's been claimed in how many, I don't know, stereotyping accounts of the East. No, they speak Persian, they speak Ottoman Turkish, most of them have an understanding of Greek, and they have an understanding of Armenian. An extraordinary account where he also says, and let's confront this issue about, destroying libraries or destroying sculptures. Everybody does it. We vandalize as much in the West as we vandalize as much in the East, and there are various reasons for this, which are usually connected with belief systems. I would have here a page, an excerpt, an extraordinary excerpt from his manuscripts, which are at the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, which has not been published, which was not included in Stanford's and Phiniopoulos' edition. And it's remarkable what he's got to say about his knowledge during his journey to this town in 1749. We know about the contents of his library. Charlemont House in Dublin is gone, but we've got his, or has been converted into the Hugh Lane Gallery, a municipal gallery of fine arts, nowadays known for the studio primarily of Bacon's. But we've got his manuscripts, and most of them are still not published in their entirety, and they are absolutely extraordinary. He also intended the first British illustrated account of a pictorial journey, yes, un voyage pittoresque, to this extraordinary town. There are also issues where he says, yes, we've all been sending vandalizers and barbars. So there's, for example, there's Dr. Askew, Anthony Askew, MD, who was an extraordinary epigrapher. He had an interest in Greek, inscriptions. And here you see his manuscript at the British Library in London, reproducing those Greek manuscripts, inscriptions, which he collected both in Athens, in Greece, and of course in Turkey. What has Charlemagne got to say? Oh yes, the man had a little chisel in his pocket, and whenever I saw him copy an inscription, afterwards he would efface the inscription because he feared the envy of his academic colleagues, another form of barbarism. Yes, indeed, these phenomena are extraordinary. And in the West as well, and yes, indeed, in the capital of the world, once again, Rome, we see here Palazzo Wedekind on Piazza Colonna, where in 1838, so it is believed, the last Roman spoils were still used for endowing and adorning a palace, a new palace, a 19th century palace going back to the 17th century palace. Yes, indeed. And this is extremely interesting, how long it actually took us to protect cultural heritage and classical heritage. It's never one-sided, it's never black and white. Down from Olympus, Suzanne Marchand, extraordinary book about the impact of Philhellenism in Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries, and once again, my wonderful colleague Zeynep Çelik, or indeed Zeynep Bahrani, or yes, indeed, Eldem here in Constantinople, who've given us so much in order to understand what the Turkish position from 1860 onwards was going to be. That long periods, as they quoted, a long period of indifference. But indifference is a universal phenomenon, as you know. And then, of course, the unforgotten Salomon Reinach, perished at Auschwitz, who indeed was a member of the Commandeur family, who published this article on Le Vandalisme moderne en Orient in the Revue des Deux Mondes. Yes, indeed, he was the brother to Theodor Reinach, who worked together with Hamdi Bey on, in fact, the discovery of Sidon. I'm Swiss, but I sometimes live in Berlin, and many years ago I stumbled through the park of Glienicke, which some of you may know. It was designed by Karl Friedrich Schinkel. And indeed, as I walked along, I came across this little still life, consisting of, yes, indeed, a column shaft and a capital from São Paulo, Fuori-le-Mura, but more importantly to me at that point were indeed these two column drums taken via Venice to Prussia in 1850 from no less than the Temple of Poseidon at Soudion. Contemporary, of course, to the Parthenon in Athens, and here they sit in the Prussian cold and indeed continue to disappear. In the same building, we have something called the Small Cloisters. It's a Byzantinism, a Byzantinist phantasm of outstanding character, taking an enormous number of Byzantine objects from Venice, initially also from Turkey, to Prussia, and here you see it. So once again, a reflection about where we stand in relation to acquiring knowledge, to vandalizing cultures, or indeed to attacking them barbarously on the basis of prejudice. Jean Chapteau-Troche, Voyage en Sibérie fait par ordre du roi en 1761. The world is much larger in the 18th century than we are sometimes nowadays inclined to understand. The Voyage en Sibérie was Chapteau-Troche's remarkable account. He was an encyclopedist, he was a friend of Diderot's, to Russia, all the way down to Siberia, in order to really study their art, their customs, their morals, and what have you. This is what Choiseul-Gouffier was driving as well. In 1782, a few years later, he would arrive here in Constantinople as French ambassador. He published what is the first example of a voyage pittoresque in 1782, the third volume only in 1812, the third volume in 1822. An enormous time lapse, given the impact Napoleon has had on all of us. Choiseul-Gouffier's account, as you may well know, is somehow ambiguous. He represents French interest, he is Turcophile or Ottomanophile to some extent, but he is also Greekophile. He's a Philhellenic representative, and he turns this publication into a political statement about the liberation of Greece. Yes, indeed, a Greek project, you might say. The publication had such influence that the French would publish 152 of these pictorial voyages until 1850. Of course, it's about measuring up cultures and measuring up geographies. And we know that geography, and I'm speaking with my colleague Gugerli at ETH Zurich, who's written a seminal book on the geography of Switzerland. The power of geographers, the power of draftsmen, the power, indeed, of these people measuring the world is something that's driving this. Their role is ambiguous. Sometimes they're spies and treated as such. Sometimes they are just bringing towards us culture. Choiseul-Gouffier was highly, highly prejudiced. It is known, and the first Discours préliminaire, which he published in 1782, is probably one of the most detrimental texts published on the Ottoman Turks at the time. And once it made the news in Constantinople and it was fed back to Paris, once again, he actually made a sort of adapted, slightly less explicit account in 1783, one of the very few copies of which are actually kept at the Royal Library in The Hague. Scientists, researchers have to find these things, indeed, in very, very remote places sometimes. The truth is not to be found in the internet, so very often. Robert de Cotte, the Ambassade de France, in a remarkable building. I'm just cruising through this. There's too much material, too much to be said about this, which I hope my colleagues will be indeed all discussing with us. For years, I've been interested in how diplomatic spaces work. And indeed, what we have here is a very explicit account in these unpublished drawings at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which actually show us how the building worked. Choiseul-Gouffier built up a collection from 1784 onwards, about 300 Grecian objects, 150 collected on the Acropolis in Athens, collected by his draftsman and archaeologist, Louis-Sébastien Fauvel. We have these catalogs, we know exactly what they contained, and once again, it would be possible to reconstruct what seems to be the first Greek museum actually set up and displayed with purpose in an embassy. This is followed by Fauvel, who became French consul, honorable consuls, French consul to Athens, where he acted for more than 30 years. And here we have this extraordinary view by Louis Dupré showing him in his garden. And indeed, in the back, you see the Acropolis rising. And he was the very first one to extract what he could, as Choiseul-Gouffier said, from Athens. And here you see the relief of the Pan-Athenaic procession in the Louvre, not at the British Museum. And indeed, these, which are currently displayed in room 347 at the Louvre, are still some of the most seminal pieces, including the stele from the Acropolis, also called the stele Choiseul-Gouffier, dating from the Periclean period. And there's also something extraordinary about this, is that Fauvel's correspondence with Choiseul-Gouffier says, yes, I was trying to grab everything I could, but as I went along, pieces kept on being vandalized. So this is where really the Western discourse about preservation that apparently the indigenous people are not able to conduct. Let's not forget it was the Venetians who brought down the Parthenon and not the Turkish rule. And this is where the plaster cast collections come in. This relief you've just seen in this terrible state was taken by Fauvel and cast. Choiseul-Gouffier wanted to have it. Fauvel cast it in plaster, sent it to Paris, where it was recopied later on for the Bonn Academic Archaeological Museum, which therefore gives you an idea how splendid that composition was. We are at the very origin here of the first architectural museums in the world. And indeed, Cassas, who was the draftsman who drew for Choiseul-Gouffier, returned to Paris and set up his own architectural museum with plaster casts and models, mostly Grecian and Roman, in Paris. 1830, 1914. Let me conclude very, very quickly. The world changes so very, very quickly indeed, and you know that 1830 and 1839, in relation to the Ottoman Empire, were crucial periods. This is where the Fossatis come in. I am not going to say anything because I'm not a specialist, indeed, of the Fossatis. I feel really honored and, as I said, humbled in front of it. It was yesterday my first day in my life in the capital of all the world's desires, and I'm still shaken by what I've seen at the Topkapi Sarai and at the Archaeological Museum, which has been the place of one of my universal desires for far too long. There we are. What I was always struck by this volume of 1852 is indeed the huge project for the University of Istanbul, or Constantinople at the time, which then, as you know far better than I ever could, was turned into the law course. And this idea of inserting, of leaving a mark behind, Western architects, Philhellenic architects, Philhellenic regimes, Philhellenic, once again, diplomats and architects working in this town and leaving a mark behind. This view prior to the fire of 1933, if it is that, and I hope so, anyway, gives that extraordinary, extraordinary outlook, that panorama of the city we've lost since 1933 and now. Perhaps we've lost it for the better. We're not here to judge. I'm a scientist. So therefore, once again, I was struck by the former British embassy at Constantinople, which, of course, is the British Consulate, erected for Queen Victoria in 1844, here, once again, nearby. And it is a copycat of nothing less than that Roman palaces of palaces, the Palazzo Farnese by Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, Michelangelo and Vignola, as well as Giacomo della Porta. A transfer from 1514 to 1840, and it strikes me in many ways that this is an exercise about cultural presence. Let me conclude very briefly now where the Germans come in. The former German embassy and now the German Consul General in Istanbul nearby was erected according to designs by two Berlin architects in 1874. That's 3 years after the foundation of the German Empire. The first newly constructed embassy building by the German Reich, which nowadays still houses, apart from the consulate itself, the Istanbul branch of the German Archaeological Institute. That is significant because archaeology has been closer to diplomacy and closer to politics than most disciplines in the humanities. An amazingly imposing building that has nowadays, perhaps for the better, vanished from the city's panorama. The building is still there, but when it was put up in 1874, of course, there was an outrage in the city, felt that, yes, indeed, this huge imperializing gesture by the Germans once again. The relations with William II and the Baghdad Ban, and indeed other remnants in the town, I don't have to go into. There were better times, let me assure you, and one of them is Heinrich Friedrich von Dietz, 1751, 1870, who was German ambassador to the Sublime Porte, and who indeed is one of the leading 18th century Orientalists, pupil of Sassis, who came here with a library of some 17,000 learned volumes and who collected 852 manuscripts from the Sarai library. Here, the catalogue of his Oriental manuscripts, which is part of a collection of 20 manuscript catalogues, where he explains every single section of his library and says, this is a good book, this is not such a good book, etc. Extraordinary characters. He lived here for 5 years and brought back 5 albums containing some of the most magnificent book illuminations from the 13th century to the end of the 18th century, the so-called Dietz albums, which I'm glad to say are finally digitized. Some 2,000 extraordinary specimens, and here you see the siege of Baghdad by the Mongolians, Timur once again. He published his Memorials, Denkwürdigkeiten von Asien in Künsten und Wissenschaften, Sitten, Gebräuchen und Altertümern, Religion und Regierungsverfassung. These are his memories about Asia in relation to the arts, sciences, morals, customs, and antiquities, religion, and the constitution of their governments. And here I'm at the end. He also publishes a book against his colleague, Hammer von Purgstall, famous here for his 10-volume history of the Ottoman Empire, contemporary. And he attacks his colleague with a book with that audacious title, Nonsense and Fraud, which is a very nice reference to the fact that these nations competed amongst each other in what was the capital of the world's desires. These exchanges are bilateral, they are multilateral, and they are amongst Westerners who project their desires on this town. Johann Wolfgang Goethe, to finish, yes, indeed, how many times has been evoked? The West-Eastern Divan, this extraordinary collection of 500 Persian and Arabic poems, published first in Stuttgart in 1819, and here in a copy that belonged to, yes, indeed, Beethoven. Beethoven, after all, and this is where I conclude really, is a contemporary of Goethe's. He's a contemporary of Dietz's. Dietz acted as their advisor in relation to the Far East and the East. The interesting thing is that Dietz didn't collect Greek antiquities. He's got some Roman busts, but apart from that, he collects geological specimen, natural specimen. He collects manuscripts. So there we are. This is a complicated history. The last image I wanted to show you is indeed the way the German legation presented itself once upon a time, and it became relative over the time as we need to read this extraordinary panorama. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for this extraordinary occasion and the chance and the potential it contains. Thank you very much. Sorry, please. Good. I hope I wasn't too long. Okay, there we are.
I would like to thank Professor Frank for his intellectual panorama of the 19th century, the long 19th century. So now we move to our first panel. Thank you. Thank you. So we are proceeding with our first panel, Architecture Across Borders from St. Petersburg to Pera. And our first speaker is Professor Paolo Girardelli. He is a full professor in the Department of History at Boğaziçi University and a dear friend. He's an architectural historian working on the multicultural heritage of the Eastern Mediterranean during the 19th century. His lecture will speak about the European architects in Pera during the long 19th century, and the title of his presentation is Between Transfer and Integration. Professor Girardelli.
Thank you, Yonja, for this introduction. I would like to thank Consul General Buravov, Consul General Thöni, and the Father Claudio Monge, the Dominican Studies Institute, and all friends and colleagues who really put their heart and their energy into the organization of this wonderful event in presence. I'm also very glad that and happy that we could meet in person. So I'm also glad that my talk comes after Professor Frank's talk. It may look like a coincidence, but that they are strictly connected. And this is both fortunate and intimidating for me, because after such a knowledgeable and erudite exposition, I hope I will be able to add something or to present things from a different point of view, maybe. So I will reflect here on how European architects were both foreigners, but also could become integrated, could become an important part of the cultural landscape of Istanbul, and particularly of this district, of the district of Pera, where diplomacy, this is a district created especially, but it's not only a matter of buildings, but it was the entire social and urban life of Pera that was linked to diplomacy. So I start with this image of, it's a cross-section and elevation in context. This is important. It is by Pierre Lorecisque, the French architect who was here in Istanbul for archaeological reason. He was helping Charles Texier taking archaeological surveys of the Byzantine and classical past. So we are very much still in this line of connections between archaeology, architecture, and politics, and geopolitics, international relations. Le Résisque designed the new French palace just after the Russian palace had been, it's in a small, I mean, it looks very small, but actually it's more imposing, and it was, the Russian palace, a landmark that changed everything here in Pera, changed the monumental standards of diplomatic architecture. So much so that, well, here we see the landscape that diplomacy was creating in the mid-19th century. So Russia, where we are now, France, and Austria, which was in the old Venetian palace. It's more modest. Why? Because it was not destroyed by the fire of 1831, which was the turning point, allowing, inspiring Russia to rebuild this embassy in monumental standards that were unprecedented. And then the other powers had to somehow compare to this standard. So France built the new French palace. Austria continued to use the Venetian embassy that had been just renovated, that in this picture, it has been just renovated by Gaspare Fossati and Léon Parvillet. But here we don't get the original impression of the context, which is amazing. This is a diorama in the Maritime Museum, the Naval Museum of Istanbul. It is a three-dimensional representation of the waterfront around Ottoman, and we see how overwhelming the Russian embassy was. This is an Armenian painter around 1850. The fire of Pera that I mentioned erased much of the residential fabric, not only most embassies, with the exception of the Venetian, then used as Habsburg Austrian palace. And it is because of the peculiar conjuncture of turning points in which Fossati arrives, I think, that he is given the chance. It is a set of elements and factors that give to Fossati this strength for really enacting a transformation of the landscape in Pera. The Treaty of Edirne, of course, is important between, well, Russia is victorious, and a lot of the funds for building this palace where we are now came through the Treaty of Edirne. The fire of 1831 and the Tanzimat charge, the Ottoman reforms just 2 years after the arrival of Fossati in Istanbul, the entire political framework of the empire starts changing and becoming more favorable for this westernizing initiatives. But more important from the point of view of architecture, I think in this context, it's also the traditional affiliation of Ottoman architecture to military engineering is flanked gradually and in part replaced by the European concept of architecture as a fine art. Fossati is a graduate of the Academy of Brera, and he carries with him a different understanding of architecture that was contested, but was also beginning to be accepted and implanted in Ottoman society and culture. Pera, where we are now, and which is the site I am focusing, Pera used to be, for medievalists and archaeologists, Pera is the Genoese district surrounded by walls that were demolished in the 1860s. But after the Ottoman conquest, there is a split between Pera and Galata. So this walled settlement begins to be called Galata almost by everyone, and Pera becomes the name of the settlement developing outside the walls, extramuros, with rather different characters because it's not as dense as Galata. It doesn't have the Genoese legacy visible, and it doesn't have this medieval art. It's a lot more Ottoman, and this Ottoman character of, well, here we see Galata, well, it's not very clear, but Galata within the walls, Pera in the mid-19th century already developing along this Grande Rue de Pera, which is Istiklal Caddesi, where we entered today from. So this is what we had on the Grande Rue in the beginning of the 19th century. It's a very different landscape, but it is interesting that this sort of high street, main street, comparable to a European main street, it was compared by someone to High Street in Edinburgh, just to mention one of the many possible analogies. This is a main street that doesn't exist in this form in the Ottoman city. Across the Golden Horn in the historic peninsula, you don't see an artery that has a sort of coherent frontages, continuous frontages. This is a European urban form, but the ingredients, the elements of this European high street are almost entirely Ottoman. These are wooden houses of the Ottoman type that were used also by Europeans. They lived very much, and the Levantines who were born in the Ottoman Empire lived there. They shared the material culture of the Ottomans for a long period. Now, elements of change in this landscape began to be inserted in the 1770s. I would say that it's a rather abrupt period of change. The 1770s, we have these are again embassies, Holland, France, and Venice next to each other. These are the dates of their establishment in these sites and the dates of the renovations that we see here. Now, while the Dutch is still an Ottoman wooden building, the French becomes a very much in keeping with Philhellenism. The French new embassy is designed in a neo-Greek, in a neoclassical, but very, very much Greek revivalist style. And then Venice also redesigns the old Casa Bailaggia, the residence of the bailiff, which was also Ottoman, was a wooden Ottoman konak, in a Palladian fashion. We see some details. Now, the Dutch palace, we are lucky to have these drawings executed by an Italian from northern Italy, very close to Switzerland, who worked for the French embassy and was given the task to take this survey. And the new Greek, the new French embassy in a Greek revivalist style, which really is remembered. It's no longer there because it was replaced by the palace that I showed in the beginning of my talk. But it's no longer there. It was remembered and assessed as a center of civilization, as a sort of academy, also with the political, of course, Choiseul-Gouffier, that was very well explained by Professor Choiseul-Gouffier, stayed here. Lord Elgin even lived here when he first moved. The British palace was not ready, and Lord Elgin settled in this palace when France was at odds with the Ottoman Empire because of the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, and then all the French property, the French embassy was taken over by the state and given to the British. So these kind of political tensions are very... this is another relief survey and the image of the Palais de France. The Venetian embassy is redesigned in a Palladian, echoing Villa Foscari in a Palladian fashion. And this is the mind behind this initiative. No other than Andrea Memmo. Andrea Memmo is very well known to architectural historians because he was a pupil of Father Lodoli. But he was not an architect, but an intellectual with, here we see that he was also behind the project of Prato della Valle in Padova, and he is portrayed here with Prato della Valle on the one hand and Palazzo Venezia in Pera under the other. So he was the mind behind this. He was also one of the early intellectuals who pursued this idea of architecture as a fine art as opposed to an aspect of engineering in the Ottoman Empire. And we go on. These are the spatial and contextual transformations of the French palace in different periods. In the end, the site also moves here in order to be in access with this small alley that connects the palace directly to Istiklal, to the Grand Rue. In this phase here and here, the Grand Rue was not so important yet, so especially before 1769. So these are now what happens after the 1831 fire? What happens with Fossati? What happens in the mid 19th century? Do we have a dichotomy of local and foreign forms in the built environment? We have this, but it's only a small part of the built environment. I would say that, so this is transfer. This is a neo-Renaissance facade. It is also on Istiklal, designed by an Armenian architect who had studied in Rome, and it's done for the Cociolo family. This is the local heritage, so these wonderful wooden structures with projecting, with full of windows, very light. And so how do we address these two extremes of the most local and the most foreign? I would say that in order to understand this, we should always think of how the society of Pera and of other Ottoman cities, Eastern Mediterranean cities, is made. So there is this mosaic or spectrum where every element is in touch with the other, and we go from the most local to the most foreign, the European visitor, the European, the Levant is with or without European citizens. Now, but they were, I mean, a European residents could marry with an Ottoman Muslim, and so getting closer to the local, to the Ottoman. I mean, Ottoman culture means also Greek, Armenian, Jewish. It is not only Islamic. And so this is the dynamic. This is the social networks in which also architecture should be understood. Look, for example, Alexandre Breschi, architect Italian, he advertises himself in French, in Greek, and in Armenian in the same ad. And my colleague Tolga Joran read the Armenian for me. He said, it's interesting because it does not correspond to the French. He says different things in order to address different audiences, different clients. So these architects are fully embedded in a spectrum of that kind. Where do they stand? I think that Fossati comes as a European visitor. He becomes a European resident for many years, for 2 decades. And he has many connections that should be uncovered, I think. Archival research will tell us a lot on how much these architects, the Fossatis, but also other Europeans, were integrated and connected to these networks. I think I should conclude. This is the architectural dynamic from the most local to the most foreign. There is all this in between. It's not just black and white. It's a huge range of nuances and contamination and interaction. So quickly, this is, for instance, how a street changes, but the DNA, part of the DNA of the Ottoman landscape remains here, even though it's modernized, it's remade. This jumba, this is a question I often discuss with my students. Several sources address the jumba, this bay window, as typically Turkish, Greek, Jewish, Armenian. Everybody may have a claim on it, but it doesn't make sense really to try to ascribe this. It's part of this multicultural landscape and does not need to be appropriated by any peculiar group. These are Italian buildings that do not, as you see, this building, can you imagine this building in Rome or Milan? No, it's all a mixture of local and of Ottoman, Levantine, and European form. Raimondo da Ronco also, this is a chart that I published many years ago of every element of architecture, from the type of building to the identity of the architect and patron to the elevation, also can be more or less local or foreign, but all possible combinations are seen in the landscape of Pera, of Izmir, of Alexandria in Egypt. It's a multicultural landscape that characterizes this. Wood is a very persistent element. Wood is used. Those embassies that I showed from the 18th century in neoclassical styles were almost entirely wooden. Wood, why is so persistent, notwithstanding fires? Wood is resistant to earthquakes, and it's not so easy to shift from, here, of course, this occurred very well, but in the course of the 19th century, even European architects have been using wood in many ways, and the masterpiece of this synthesis is Raimondo da Ronco, the famous summer embassy in Tarabia. I'm not showing you a picture of the present state, which is deplorable. It's dilapidated and falling apart and should be saved, like many other masterpieces of this Levantine architectural world. These are works by... See, da Ronco is able to dialogue with the Ottoman legacy because he has behind all this history of European, Italian, Swiss builders who came before him and prepared the ground for interacting with the local. So you may try to ignore the local culture as it is done in some official buildings, but the local culture is there, and it's impossible to go on without establishing a relation. The last image is very little known. I published this in 2017, but it's Giuseppe Fossati, designed for the Sardinian embassy, for the embassy of the Savoy. It was not built. It was on the southern side of Istiklal, Rue de Pera, and it is preserved in the State Archives of Torino. Here we see from the layout that there is something of the Ottoman centralized layout, although all the distribution is more European, but the structure from the thinness from the number of windows, the structure, we understand that it's obviously wooden. It is the local wooden tradition. So, thank you very much for your attention.
So, thank you, Paolo. We now proceed to learn the career of Fossati, Gaspare Fossati in Russia. We will hear from Yulia Ratomskaya. She is an academic secretary of the Shushev State Museum of Architecture in Moscow, author of publications on Russian medieval architecture, curator of exhibitions on ancient Russian architecture, the architecture of the Byzantium and Venice. So welcome, thank you.
Good day. I'm pleased for invitation for this very interesting conference, and my theme, architect Gaspare Fossati, career in Russia, and it's very interesting that the young architect Gaspare Fossati, who spent his childhood in Venice, was educated in Milan, Accademia di Belle Arti di Brera, began his professional career in Rome, appeared in St. Petersburg, but it was not by chance. St. Petersburg, the capital of Russian Empire, was a very international city during 18th and 19th centuries. In the capital of the Russian Empire, there was a long tradition of work by Swiss architects of Italian origin, mainly from the Canton of Ticino. St. Petersburg and the second Russian capital, Moscow, actively updated the appearances during the neoclassical period of the second half of the 18th and first third of the 19th centuries. A great state project, the customer of which was Russian sovereigns, private orders of members of the royal family, orders of the Russian aristocracy, the state assignation bank, the military postal departments gave the opportunity to visiting architects to prove themselves professionally, as well as to receive decent fees for their activities. Brilliant architects and good professionals such as Giacomo Quarenghi, Vincenzo Brenna, Domenico Gilardi, Luigi Rusca, and others became the creators of Russian architecture of the neoclassical era. These architects, along with Russian architects and craftsmen of English and French origin, influenced the appearance of two Russian capitals and a number of provincial cities. Obviously, it was family ties and contacts that led Gaspare Fossati around 1833 to St. Petersburg in the studio of the architect Luigi Rusca. Luigi Rusca, also a native of Swiss Ticino Canton, by the time of Fossati's arrival, he had finished his activities in Russia, returned to his homeland, where he died. However, his architectural workshop continued to function. Ludwig Charlemagne, the nephew of Rusca's wife, was the head of his workshop. Family relations were cemented by professional ones. 4 years later, in 1837, Gaspare Fossati married the daughter of Luigi Rusca, and the architectural workshop became quite a family business. Gaspare Fossati carried through his whole life an attitude to work as a family business. While working in Constantinople, he invited his brother-in-law Alessandro Rusca and his 17-year-old brother Giuseppe Fossati to join his architectural team. In the 1830s, when Fossati worked in the capital of Russian Empire, the architectural projects of national importance were created in St. Petersburg. The lifting and installation of the Alexandra column by French-born architect Auguste Montferrand in 1832 completed the formation of the ensemble of Palace Square. This monument glorified the emperor and the power of Russian weapons. The architect and engineer Antonio Adamini Antonio Adamini, who came from the canton of Ticino, implemented this project. Also, the design, construction, and decoration of St. Isaac's Cathedral, designed by Auguste Montferrand, occupied the minds of architects of St. Petersburg for several decades. Antonio Adamini and future stars of the historism style in Russia, Alexander Brylov, Andrey Schneider, and others participated in building of St. Isaac's Cathedral. During this period, Emperor Nikolai I entrusted the main projects mainly to representatives of the French architectural diaspora in St. Petersburg. The beginning of the 1830s in Russian architecture was marked by the dominance of neoclassical trends. However, in the family of the sovereign, in his close circle, there was an interest in Gothic style due to the spread of romantic moods. This led to the construction of a so-called cottage, a country house of the royal family in the Alexandria Park in Peterhof, Scottish architect Adam Menelaus. The family ties of the Empress Alexandra Feodorovna with Prussia influenced the decision to invite the German architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel to work on a number of projects, including the Gothic chapel, the Church of Alexander Nevsky in Peterhof. In 1831, 1846, the neo-Gothic Church of St. Catherine in Pargolova was built according to the project of Alexander Brylov. Customers show a desire to see the new buildings not only in the styles of Neo-Greek, Pompeian style, but also the origins of ancient Russian architecture. In the 1820s and 1830s, after the retirement of Luigi Rusca, his architectural workshop didn't have significant orders. Unfortunately, the activities of Gaspar Fossati are poorly documented during this period, but the surviving documents and indirect evidence allow us to compile a story about the activities of the young architect in Russia. In 1830s, Gaspar Fossati took orders for the reconstruction of St. Petersburg nobility houses, which changed owners or the nature of use. He also designed new buildings. The palace located in the main street of the capital of Nevsky project had changed many owners. It is known as the Petrovo-Solovova house or the Bernardaki house. In 1832, the estate was leased to the main pedagogical institute. The interiors was adapted for the educational process. In 1835, Gaspar Fossati rebuilt the main building for the new owner, Count Branitsky. The change in the appearance of the palace was expressed in the superstructure of the side parts, the device of arches, passages deep into the plot. A large six-column portico topped with a triangular pediment was preserved in the front facade decoration. Fossati decorated the front facade with new reliefs glorifying Russian military victories, neoclassical frieze, and also placed the coat of arms of the owners, the Polish Branitsky family. Sorry. This one. In the field of the pediment. It was being particularly preserved. The interiors currently represent different layers of different times, including neoclassical style of the beginning of the 20th century. On the first floor, in the two front enfilads that radiate from the main staircase, several interiors designed by Fossati have been preserved. The so-called room with caryatids has a pass-through function. The hall is designed in the neoclassical style, tending to so-called the late Russian classicism, which used the theme of Greek antiquity. The caryatids that give the hall its name define the image of the Greek interior. They highlight the portals located opposite, leading the other halls of the enfilade, and also decorate the plane of the wall located opposite the windows. Their figures were supposed to remind the portico of caryatids in the Athenian Erechtheion. Excessive caryatid decoration includes Egyptian motif. Sorry? The types of faces are close to the work of the sculptor Vitali's workshop. Fossati rounded the corners of the hall, located opposite the windows. They probably housed heating furnaces. The semicircular tympanos above the caryatids and corner niches placed on the free plane of the rounded walls give the elongated hall the impression of roundness. The encircling frieze of the upper part of the walls unites the space. It is based on the ancient Greek decorative motif. Decorative motif on design on the upper part of the columns of the Erechtheion. Perhaps the decoration of the hall suggested picturesque sailings. The poetry of the artistic solution influenced the design of the next hall. it was remodeled at the beginning of the 20th century when the house belonged to the Yusupov family. The coat of arms above the portal testifies to this. It can be assumed that the basis of the interior was created by Gaspare Fossati. The stylistics of the design, proportions, and the use of artificial marble correspond to the 1830s. The semicircular tympanus correspond to similar motifs of the hall with caryatids. This impression corresponds to the elements used in the design of the decorative frieze. The horn of plenty, which have turned into floral ornamental elements located together with Greek palmets, which looked copied from the ancient craterium. It is interesting that horn of plenty and palmets are used in the frieze that adorns the front facade of this house. An additional confirmation of our assumption is the plastic reliefs characteristics of the third of the 19th century, as well as connecting the unconnected. The inclusion of the Gothic three-lobed arch here in a Neo-Greek frieze. Fossati combined the Neo-Greek female figures and the Egyptian motif in the room with caryatids using the same principle. The theater hall located on the opposite side of the grand staircase was also designed by Gaspare Fossati. This is a vast rectangular space located along the windows with the stage and auditorium. In the center of the hall, located opposite the windows, a theater box was arranged, decorated as a pronounced templon in antis. The walls are divided by pilasters as if supporting an entablement. Decorated with a vegetable frieze. The walls are divided by pilasters as if, this is reminiscent of the composition of the hall near the hall with caryatids. High rectangular windows are correlated with portals placed in the intercolumnials. Semicircular tympanus are used in the design of the end wall and portals on the sides of the box. This method is used in the room with caryatids and the hall next to it. The ancient Greek theater decor is abundantly used in the design of the theater interior. The nature of the decor evokes the composition used by Fossati in the front facade. Stucco ornament in the form of grapevines on the ceilings continue the theatrical theme, also reminiscent of the Dionysian mysteries. Their style also echoes the design of the front facade. In St. Petersburg, on Tchaikovsky Street 27, the so-called Orlov-Davidov mansion is located. The initial stage of construction of main house of the city estate dates back to 1839. It is associated with Gaspare Fossati. In 1874, the house was significantly rebuilt according to the project of architect Gedicke. Additional two storage appeared is visualized the new function purpose of the building and apartment facility. During the Soviet period, all historical interiors were lost. Revealing the original features of the structure related to Fossati project, we can say that the building was stretched along the street and was originally two-storied. The facade decor was changed many times. Different shapes of the ground floor windows have been preserved. The neoclassical long cast iron this one. The neoclassical long cast iron balcony, decorated with the meander and wreaths, decorative sandwiches of the windows of the first floor most likely belong to the reconstruction of 1870. Triple windows were used on the ground floor. The neoclassical bay windows of the first floor overhanging the triple windows could belong to the original project. The bay window is known in another St. Petersburg building by Fossati. The only house designed by Gasparo Fossati, whose appearance hasn't changed much, has been preserved in Peterhof. The building was erected in 1836-1838 as a country house of Всеволожский. It was located in an urban environment in the city of Peterhof, which appeared next to the suburban imperial residence founded by Peter the Great and practically rebuilt by Empress Catherine the Great, according to the project of the great architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli. The corner plot is located at the intersection of the main street of Peterhof, the Petersburg Avenue, and Razvodная Street, which leads to the main entrance to the palace along the fence of the upper garden of the imperial residence. In contrast of the established tradition, Fossati put an elongated building along the diagonal of the site so that its front facade was directed at the crossroad. It was one of the first free layout of the building to be used in Russian country house architecture. Probably the theme of English Gothic was chosen for a figurative solution or at the request of the customer. The imperial cottage Adam Menelaus could be mentioned as a prototype. The architect could study English Gothic by engravings and illustration descriptions of Britain. Fossati tried to balance the facet solution. The faceted tower with machicoulis, creating the image of a medieval castle erected in the center of the structure, performs exactly this function. Fossati used symmetry of the arrangement of triangular roofs, of triple windows, decorative motifs of castle architecture, Gothic hill-shaped niches, Gothic shelves on consoles above the windows located next to neoclassical rosette. Unfortunately, the interiors of this house were lost in the 19th century. Publications of researchers, in particular Godfrey Goodwin, report on other Fossati buildings in Russia. Not all of them are confirmed by documents. Some may be the project of architects of a workshop whom Fossati helped as an architectural assistant. Successful but modest projects of a young architect could hardly help him in building his career in Russia. Just like Luigi Rusca and many architects who were educated outside the Russian Empire, Gaspar Fossati tried to enter the circle of architects who graduated from St. Petersburg Academy of Arts. It is known that in 1836, Fossati took part in the exhibition of St. Petersburg Academy of Arts, where his project of 2 hotels on the railway was noted. For this project, Fossati was awarded the title of appointed to the academicians. On the 31st of December 1836, he received a program for the project of a noble assembly for the capital, successfully implementation of which would have earned him the title of academician of St. Petersburg Academy of Arts. It is not very clear whether the project of Nobel Academy was completed, but in 1837, Fossati was appointed to Constantinople to design the Russian embassy at the request of Tsar Nikolai I. It seems that the choice of a young architect to fulfill such an important mission should have been the result of some event related not only to his personal charm, but also to his professional activity. Such a bright event was the design of the station of in Tsarskoye Selo, one of the 3 stations of Russian first railway. Just a moment. It was built in 1836. The Tsarskoye Selo railway station, designed by Gaspari Fossati, triumphantly welcomed on the 30th of September 1837, the steel horse carrying many carriages at once, the first flight of the first Russian railway being its final destination. Gaspari Fossati could receive this order as a result of an architectural competition announced by the joint stock company builder of the road. The history of architectural competitions in Russia at the end of the 18th, first half of the 19th century suggests that the result was most often determined by the opinion of the emperor. It can be assumed that the meeting of the young winner of the competition for the station building with the emperor determined the future fate of Fossati. The impression that the young architect made on Nikolai I allowed the Tsar to entrust him with the execution of the order for the design of Russian embassy in Constantinople. Railway historians believe that the station building in Tsarskoye Selo, designed by Fossati, existed until 1851. The new building was erected according to the project of architect Konstantin Thöni. But it seems that this building, which destroyed and rebuilt in the early of 20th, may be the result of the creative activity of Fossati, because the style of this building is very close to the house of Всеволожский in Peterhof. That's all. Thank you.
I'm sorry for keeping the time, but We now have to proceed to the discussion. May I invite the speakers to the stage, please? Professor Frank, Professor Girardelli, Miss Julia, and can we have the chairs? I will take questions from the floor as well, but let me break the ice for you. Thank you all for your valuable presentations. In child development, there is this consistent debate on whether the genes prevail or the environment. And I just want to open up this discussion over Fossati because we have seen examples from Russia and a few examples from Istanbul as well. So the role of the architect, is it coming inherently or is it affected by the environment? I thought it could be a joint question for all of you. So.
I also agree that there is probably not an essential sense of place or James Martin. I think James Martin is after the content construction, so it can change in many ways. And what we see in the transformations of the cultural landscapes of Istanbul is precisely this. So we have a strong Roman Byzantine roots, but this takes up very different forms, very different directions. And of course, in the 18th and 19th century, this hybridity is also more evident, but there has always been a relation between, for instance, classes of architecture style and the Renaissance of the West, centralized plan of mosques. It's hard to see these two worlds as separate, but as a connection. And with Russia in the picture, really is not
Maybe at this point we can also speak about the patrons as well.
Yes.
It seems to me that our podcast and that we listen to, they are very important because we, like Istanbul, is a city of Byzantine architecture and a city with mass constructions. And the 19th century is also a very interesting subject. And this conference show us very interesting architects who came from Europe and made so many for this region of Pera. And I think The first steps in our education was a report. I think it's also very interesting.
So thank you. If there are questions from the floor, you can raise them. I have many questions myself, but I can ask them over the coffee break. If there are no questions, we can maybe perhaps move to the... Oh, sorry, please. Now, maybe you can come from, you can speak from here.
No, this is obviously a very, very charged term, Orientalism, as it's become through Edward Said's book of 1978. It's a neologism, I think, to start with. I think we're working often with neologisms, and particularly when they turn into isms, I think they become complicated in terming, in stereotyping, and in terms of generalizations. And it's been said time and time before that, this was an enormous communicative space since the occupation in 1453, and it continued to be so. And I think there were mercantile interests because it was the gate to the East. And I think we've got to recognize that there are interests in this which are varied and which are not in themselves, I think, prejudicial. And we've seen that there was a long period of accommodation, of exchange, and I find this sort of admirable when I read that, the Sultan on occasion could imprison foreign ambassadors during periods of, conflict, and then at the same, there was no real consequence, nobody died, as far as I've read it. What I'd like to say about that is I think we ought to start looking again and again and again at the sources. And they tell us a different story. And they tell us about people who acted in prejudicial fashion. And then there are people who acted and reacted in educated fashion. And I think the more educated you are, the more, and this has always been the case. We've seen, you look at 16th century humanists, and what they've got to say about Turkey, it's not very pleasant. And you look at 17th century texts, and it's not very pleasant. But you also find 17th century texts which are highly, appreciative, and who understand that this works according to different parameters, different expectations, and different representations. Thank you.
then there were representatives of Moldavia, Wallachia, the South Peninsula, but then, so the first to go to Pera under the coalition of the French, and then in the 17th century, everybody's here, and in the 18th century, but the Iranian embassy is in Jalal, because it's because it's a different place. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for our panelists.
Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. We are going to take a little break now. We will have a short coffee break, which will give you the occasion to contemplate the Blue Lounge. We'll see you back at 11:30. Please enjoy.